right, welcome to Bradford and Brooks. Jim Brooks and Margie Bradford's on special assignment this week, and I'm joined in the studio by a very special guest who's no stranger to WBRT, Mr. Jim Waters. Jim Waters is president and CEO of the Bluegrass Institute for Public Policy Solutions. And good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Jim.
And, Jim and Jim, that's right. I am.
That's an idea for another show, by the way, to create another. We should talk to Roth about that.
Okay, well, let's do that. One thing I was always, one of the mistakes I think I've made in the past was picking a domain name, because Nelson County Gazette spelled out is quite a long URL. Mm-hmm. But I think you did the right thing with Bluegrass Institute for Public Policy Solutions by abbreviating it to BIPS.org.
Yeah, exactly. And don't forget the S. The S is for solutions.
Oh, okay.
And you know, Jim, when we started the Bluegrass Institute 20 years ago, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary, we didn't want to just analyze problems. Mm-hmm. We didn't want to just, and that's important. It's important to analyze. It's important to understand what's happening. But we wanted to offer solutions mm-hmm. from a free market perspective.
Right.
You know? So sometimes that word gets left off unintentionally, and I always remind everyone that that's there intentionally. Yes.
Remind me of that.
And you can find us at bips.org, by the way, on our website, BIPPS. It is short, and I am thankful for that, being able to use that. Folks here in Kentucky know what that is, so that's great.
Right. Well, Jim, I always appreciate our conversations in your columns because they, you give of course, I guess we're all guilty of looking at how legislation affects our community, our county, mm-hmm. and ourselves. Mm-hmm. You know, and the Bluegrass Institute kind of offers a view from a larger perspective mm-hmm. of the impact of policy. And I've always appreciated that, because I've seen perspectives that, you know, sometimes if you're only looking in your community, you don't see mm-hmm. the big picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we are concerned about how policy affects most Kentuckians, mm-hmm. not just a special interest or not just one group versus the other. And I think one of our founding principles is that we look at the long-term effects of policy and how it affects the greatest number of Kentuckians rather than a short-term effect. So many times, you know, we see things coming out of Frankfort or maybe even City Hall or county government mm-hmm. that are for short-term political gain. Right. You know, let's just say it the way it is. But they don't really have a long-term positive impact on a great number of people. In fact, many of those ideas often end up having negative consequences for the larger community. So mm-hmm. we intentionally wanted to look at, when we started the Institute, we intentionally committed to looking at policy from a wider perspective. So I appreciate you saying that. I think that's a really good way of articulating what we try to do with policy, especially when you have disagreement, you know, because is the disagreement about a particular interest, or is it really about a principled issue? Mm-hmm. Certainly, we're opposed to any policy that increases the size or cost or scope of government. Right. You know, we think government's big enough already, and we need to shrink the size of it rather and also expand individual liberty and expand mm-hmm. the ability of individuals to determine their own path, you know, and their own pursuit, if you will, of happiness. Mm-hmm. Not what the government thinks is happiness, but what individuals think. So there's a balancing act there sometimes, you know, but mm-hmm. but we always try to err on the side of the free market and those principles that have made our country great, made our state great. Right. So,
right. Yeah. Well, Jim, your most recent column was focused on education, mm-hmm. and there was another state talked about a declaration of emergency about their state's education, mm-hmm. and question, is there a need for that here in Kentucky? Education is always a hot button issue in Kentucky because I think there are lots of people have very different ideas for the way things should be. Now, superintendents I've talked to will tell you that school choice, i.e. charter schools, are are evil, that they will suck money from, the public school system. I mean, they can rattle off all of the evils of charter schools. And then my question is, well, if a charter school underperforms, you can close it. You can't close a public school if it underperforms, and we have many of them that do.
Yeah, well, you could, but it doesn't happen, right?
Right.
But you bring up I think you bring up the key point, Jim, to this debate, and that is that charter schools are schools of choice. Now, they are public schools.
Right.
They're publicly funded. They must abide by the same testing requirements, the same requirements in terms of civil rights and all that, which most schools do anyhow, public or private.
Sure.
But they have to, and they're required to. But the difference is they're run differently than a traditional public school. The teachers' unions and the opponents of school choice have a really difficult time with charter schools because they are public schools. But they want to misinform and mischaracterize them as somehow being private schools or schools that cater only to the best students. But that's not the case. If you look at the actual data from around the country, a majority of the students in public charter schools in America today, almost 3.5 million students now, over 8,000 charter schools, are low-income minority students. 58% of those students are coming from low-income minority homes, because we have 45 states with charter school laws. Kentucky is the only state with a charter school law that doesn't have any charter schools, which we're working on. But the point about the way the schools themselves are that a majority of the kids that go there are from minority or low-income homes, and all of the laws in the country prohibit creaming of the crop, as we hear the opponents say. They prohibit that. You must take first come, first served, and if there are more students that want to get in, then there are seats available. You have to have what's called a random lottery, and that means that you can't pick and choose. It's got to be random. So even in Kentucky's law, which was actually passed originally back in 2017, that was the case. You cannot pick and choose. Now, a magnet school can have entry requirements, and that's what some people don't understand the difference. But there's a big difference in a magnet school and a charter school. A magnet school, we see them in Louisville and larger areas. They can have admission requirements. They can have academic requirements in terms of admissions. So that's not a charter school. That's really more like a private school, although they're called magnet schools. So there's a difference. It's really important to understand charter schools are public schools, but they're managed differently. And I think this is important because we see there's a new report out by Credo, which is at Stanford University, which is Center for Research on Education there. And, a few years ago, they came out with a study that was somewhat not a full study. They really didn't look at charter schools in terms of the impact so much that they have after kids have been in there for several years. Well, they did, but they sort of buried that. But there's a new report out confirming that kids that are in charter schools, the longer they're there, students, the better they perform. And in many places in the country, charter schools are outperforming the traditional public schools in their neighborhoods. So we're comparing apples to apples here. We're comparing students that come from the same neighborhoods and the same income, same homes, So now we're finding that charter schools are closing that gap between black and white students, between minority and white students, between rich and poor students, and they're not only closing it, they're moving ahead.
Well, I know that here in Kentucky, it seemed as though the Louisville community, poor and minority students and those representing them, really were some of the loudest voices asking for charter schools in their area as a choice to not have to go to underperforming schools or schools they believed were underperforming.
Yeah, and the whole point about accountability, by the way, we hear this from opponents, is that charter schools are not as accountable as private or as traditional public schools. But if you think about it, as you said, if a charter school does not perform, does not meet the expectation of parents, that's the highest form of accountability you can have. They can be shut down, and they are shut down if there's financial mismanagement or if they don't meet the conditions of their charters. And, you know, when we get charter schools in Kentucky here, they're going to have to agree to a charter. That's why they're called charter schools, because in the charter, it not only talks about how they'll be financed, where they'll be located and how they'll be run and what their emphasis will be, but it also says, here's at the level we're going to perform, and in exchange for that, we're going to have some freedom from some of the regulations that traditional public schools have had that we feel hold back a lot of great teachers and great schools. And we don't think this is just for the urban areas either. We think that online, there's many great virtual charter schools around the country. Even in smaller communities, we think that there's going to be an increased demand, and as a result, a supply that meets the needs of students. And that's really, at the end of the day, what this has to be about. It has to be about what's best for students. And we have students in rural parts of our state that if they want to go on to an engineering degree at UK or an advanced degree of some kind in physics or some of the other areas that require advanced math and advanced placement classes, and their districts aren't able to provide those, they need to have access to those. So we need to have all kinds of options here, not just one or two. This needs to be about what can we do that's best for students, and not just protecting a system because it's been there for so long, you know. And you're right about what in Louisville, we've worked with a group of inner city pastors there for several years, and you know, they see every day the results of a public system that leaves too many of their children behind. Even the schools they're being bused to, the gaps are really large in those schools. Now, many of those schools in East Louisville, as you know, east of I-65, I think there's been a perception that those schools are doing better, and they are for white students. But see, the students that are being best there from the inner city have not made the progress that they would have made in their own neighborhood schools. So at some point, we've got to say, when does education policy become about what's best for the students and not just protecting the system? Right.
Now, it kind of always has amazed me that we have a charter school law, but actually, I guess the creation allowing charter schools depends on the local school district for the most part. And I thought, well, they're not, most superintendents aren't going to be in favor of a local charter school. You know, and I know that I think Jefferson and Fayette County are a little separate, different cases as far as there, but still, and there's still, you know, the worry about the money follows the student, and what's that going to do to my district, et cetera, et cetera. But you know,
but the money. But you know, let's talk about that for a second, because the money always is a big part of this discussion. It does take resources to educate students, but the monies that are expended by the General Assembly, by the way, the largest single area of our general fund budget by far is education, K through 12. Over 40% of every dollar, over 40 cents of every dollar in the general fund gets spent on K through 12 education. But I ask this question: what is the money for, you know, anyhow? What are those dollars for? Is it to prop up a system? Is it to continue to support mediocrity in the education system? Or is it to really educate students? And if it really is about that, then I think the opponents who want to deny parents a choice or parents an option of sending their children to a school that works better for their students, I think they have a real problem, because if the public education system is meeting the needs, then there won't be a demand for choice. There won't be a demand for other alternatives like charter schools or like other options. So what are our opponents to this afraid of? I mean, if, as they say, the public system is doing a great job. Now, what we hear is, well, if you would give us more money, we would do a great job. But really, at what point does it become about something other than the money? Because we're spending $17 or $18,000 per pupil in Kentucky on public school students. And I think you're going to have a hard time convincing the average parent or the average taxpayer that those aren't adequate resources to prepare our kids for the future. And yet we look at the latest NAEP scores, and 1 in 4 of our students are reading proficiently, only 1 in 4, and over half are performing at the lowest level on that test. So if you're not prepared, and those are 8th graders, which is a really concerning thing, because really by 4th grade, the reading experts and scientists say, if you're not prepared to read to learn, you're really left behind the rest of your educational career. So we've got reading and math issues here, and yet we've got all these other fights that are going on in the public school system. But with that performance, what do opponents say about is throwing more money at this somehow going to automatically solve this problem? Because we've increased funding for education a lot, especially since CARA was passed. And then in just the past few years, Jim, there have been record amounts of education spending by the legislature, and yet we still hear opponents saying, well, we're not giving raises to teachers. But see, that's not true, because the legislature increased funding to local districts to make those decisions. So I think that's the right way to do it, don't you? What's happening in Nelson County or Bardstown may be a lot different than what's happening in Jackson County or Breathitt County in eastern Kentucky, Jackson, Kentucky.
Right. Well, that's true. That's true. Because Nelson County is considered I don't want to say more affluent, but we have a lot of growth in the property valuation. That affects our SEEK money negatively. And so over the years, as the county has prospered, the SEEK money has continued to drop. And of course, that's by design, because you really want to help the poor counties that don't have a lot of local, revenue. But anyway.
But see, there was 2 parts to CARA, and that was one part. We got that. So we have a very centralized funding to ensure that counties that don't have high property values get adequate educational resources. Right. But Jim, the other part of that bill was totally ignored, which was, we believe that every child can learn at the highest level. Where is the passion for that versus the passion for more money and to make sure we get the funding right? What is the funding for? The funding is to educate students. Right. And if we're not doing that, then the problem is not the funding. The problem is how those dollars may be being used, or how the decisions being made on how we educate, or whether we and we think that giving parents an option here would create the kind of competitive environment that would cause our public schools to do better, and that's what we should all want.
Well, I can see that, after COVID, and I know that the results of the distance learning were vary by region and county. But I think that showed that, a distant charter school is a possibility. And of course, all this depends on individual learners. There's some kids who just aren't going to, they need in-person instruction. Right. And then, I know kids who, if they study it on a computer, they've got it. Yeah. And that comes down to choice and individual need, and meeting those needs of the students.
Well, we have a one-size-fits-all system right now, largely. But I do think that COVID opened the eyes of parents regarding what is and is not happening in their public schools. And the fact is, we know from a lot of the numbers, especially from Jefferson County, for example, that many low-income minority kids did not get online. No. Or if they did, they didn't stay there. Right. And we lost, we think, at least 10,000 kids through COVID in terms of losing out on learning, a couple of years of learning. Oh, yeah. And we were already behind. That demographic largely was already behind, when it came to educational performance. So you're exactly right. That's why we need all kinds of options. We need online. These ideas of local, micro schools, or learning pods, where parents can associate together without having all of the regulations of having having to meet all the regulations, say, of a daycare and all of those regulations. If a couple of families want to associate together and educate their kids, we should make a way for them to do that. Many other states are doing this. States around us, Indiana has all kinds of choice. West Virginia, Jim, we used to compare ourselves to West Virginia, and now they have all kinds of universal school choice is what we call it, because they have all kinds of options. They have scholarships for non-public education. They have charter schools and the funding for that. So, and you know, here again, we talk about the seat money and it would follow the student, but that's what it's for. And if a student is not getting educated in a traditional public school, why would we, if we really care about the education of that student, want to force them to stay in a school that is not the best fit for them?
Yeah, it's not meeting their needs.
And I'm not saying it's not for all. I mean, we think the public system is doing a great job with about 25% of our students, you know. But what about all the rest of the students, those who are dropping out, about the same number on the other end? And then you have the middle, you know. So we need more options, more choices. And if you look at all the states, I mean, 45 states have charter schools and charter school laws that are working. And they're not destroying public education. In fact, if you look in Florida, on our website, if you go under our blog on our website, on the pull-down menu, you can find a lot of information about comparing Florida with Kentucky. And guess what's happened? The more choice Florida has gotten, the better their public system has performed, and they're actually spending less in their public system than Kentucky is. So if we want public education to improve, unless we're going to stick our heads in the sand and say it's doing great, which all the NAEP results show are not true. Even our state results, which are not, we don't think are as accurate, but they're still showing that we have serious issues with gaps in academic performance.
Right.
So if we really care about that, then why wouldn't we want the policies that will make that happen? You know, and that are proven. I'm not talking about theory here. I'm talking about proven policies. Florida has tens of thousands of kids in their choice. In fact, hundreds of thousands of kids that are getting some kind of benefit from school choice. But guess what? That's benefiting everyone in the public system. The rising tide is lifting all the boats. And, you know, our opponents never want to talk about this. They want to talk about what's going to happen with public schools if we have school choice. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what's happening in other states. Not just about throwing more money at the problem. We've increased spending greatly since CARA was passed. And so I think that's right, too, by the way. I think to equalize, what I mean is it's right to equalize funding and have equitable funding. But why wouldn't we want the same for parents and families who don't have big incomes? Why wouldn't we want to also provide them with some funding where they could put their child in a better school? Why? It's the same thing, only on an individual level.
Right. All right. Well, Jim, let's take a quick commercial break. You're listening to Bradford and Brooks. Well, actually, Jim and Jim this morning here on WBRT. And we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back after these messages. So please stay tuned. All right, you're back with Bradford and Brooks, otherwise known today as the Jim and Jim Show. Jim Waters and Jim Brooks here. And Jim Waters is the president and CEO of the Bluegrass Institute for Public Policy Solutions.
That's right.
And,
good job.
and Jim and I go way back together, and been a friend of the show and the Nelson County Gazette for a long time. And
thank you, by the way, for including our column in there. And it's in there this week, so be sure to check it out. So
that's right. You can check out Jim's latest on the Nelson County Gazette. And, you know, education is always, of course, my kids are out of college now, but education, when you're a parent, is one of the most important jobs you think there are. I mean, you got to get your kids up, got to get them to school, and then they're in somebody else's hands for the day. And, you know, and you trust that they're going to get a quality education. You know? Now, you talk about not being able to get the classes they need. Well, my son is gifted in science and math. And one of the high schools he went to here, he wanted, he was begging for physics. They had no physics teacher. He couldn't get it. I mean, that was, sorry.
Yeah.
You know, and to me that wasn't acceptable, but, what do? You can't.
So why wouldn't we allow him, right? A hybrid situation.
Right.
If he needs to be in the classroom part of the day, and that works, but he also has a need that's not being met, right? Why wouldn't we allow a few dollars to go to an online class that even maybe the school would supervise or whatever? But still, Jim, it's got to be about the students. It's got to be about what's best for the students, and I'm sorry, but I appreciate the work superintendents do. And by the way, I will say we've actually helped return much of the decision-making ability to superintendents, because at one time they were pretty much at the mercy of the site-based council, which was not elected, really. I mean, they were elected by the school, but they weren't really created for that. But shouldn't have been making these important personnel, curriculum, financial decisions. Sure. That's a board decision, and that's the superintendent that the board hires decision. So we haven't been anti-superintendent. Now, the superintendent's organization sued to stop the school choice bills, and I think that's a shame, because if I'm a superintendent, my concern should be, first and foremost, what best meets the needs of my students, not just the money that I'm getting, but how can we best provide for the education that they need? Shouldn't that be the top priority?
Well, let me take the flip side of that. Yeah, that is the priority, but also to have the money to do that.
Yeah, well,
and again, there's that fear, and you hear it every time there's a discussion about it, that it's going to siphon too much money from the public schools.
Well, but these are public schools. But charter schools are public schools. So what we're saying then is we can only have one kind of school. See, and that's what I'm talking about. Is if charter schools are public schools, and there's plenty of places in this country. I mean, California isn't exactly the hotbed of conservatism, right? I think they have more charter schools than any state, or they're certainly one of the top. They have hundreds of charter. They have over 800 charter schools in California. So we're not talking here. This should not be about a partisan issue, and it really shouldn't be about money, because the dollars that are going to a charter school, those are public options, and it's not like we haven't offered public options in the past. Some have not. They haven't proven to work as well as charter schools have across the country. So what is there to be afraid of? That's my question. Is it because it's something different? Is it because it's managed differently, run differently? Or is it because we want to maintain the control and the power over all the money? And I'm just saying this out with all due respect, okay, that this has to become more about what's best for students. And if it is, then we're going to find a way to get your son the class he needs. We're going to find a way to get the education to the students, and what's best for them. And I think that's really a unfortunate argument to make, that well, if we have another kind of public school, that's going to take money away from what we're used to. Well, what we're used to is only really providing 1 in 4 students in terms of reading proficiency an adequate education. So it's not working that way.
Right.
So, the question, I think, is where do we go from here, Jim?
Well, I guess the next session of the General Assembly really isn't that far away.
Right.
And
it will be here.
and I assume that there will be legislation, and there'll be lots of discussion. And well, of course, a lot of the legwork for the General Assembly is done in the interim.
That's right.
In committees.
That's right.
And if you're interested in anything happening in the legislature, find the meetings. They archive them on KET.
Yeah.
And that's really where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah. And I think, by the way, it's great to have those available for the citizens to watch. But at the end of the last session, there was a constitutional amendment passed out of the Elections Constitutional Amendments Committee, and it had a constitutional amendment statement on there that would remove barriers to choice in Kentucky, and I think we're going to see that happen, because after the Kentucky Supreme Court ruled against House Bill 563, which was passed in 2021, and last year they ruled against that, the only high court in the nation to do so, they actually helped us in that ruling by saying, if you want this type of choice, you will need to amend the Constitution, which we know is a big challenge in Kentucky. Sure. But the fact is, this constitutional amendment passed out of committee. It got a second reading. Representative Jason Nemus, who's the House Majority Whip, made a statement not long ago, earlier this year, that after the Kentucky Supreme Court opinion, he called it a temporary setback, which I agree, it's temporary. And he said it's actually going to be a really good thing for Kentucky students and Kentucky families to go forward, because we're going to have robust school choice. This is going to be a priority. The bills that have been passed have been fairly small ball in terms of actual impact that they would have. But this constitutional amendment would not dictate a particular kind of choice. This would simply remove an obstacle to all kinds of choices. And with what's happening in the states around us, we would not only have charter schools, we're going to have education opportunity accounts, we're going to have perhaps learning disabled, scholarships for the learning disabled, we're going to have learning pods, we're going to have micro schools, we're going to have all kinds of options for parents, which is the way it should be. So in the long term, the superintendents have sued, thinking small. I have to say, I think it's really small to sue to stop a particular kind of public school choice. Okay, that's pretty, I mean, I can understand more maybe some of the other actions. But still, why would we, even in those, why would we deny parents that option? If education's really about providing our kids with the best opportunity for a great future, they're getting it in other states. Do we want people moving to other states? Do we want to lose families because Indiana has robust choice? Do we want kids from Indiana coming over here, taking advantage of school of school options and having paid for on that side of the river? Do we really want to do that kind of thing? And if we don't catch up here, we're going to be left behind. We already are behind, but we need to catch up, and we can. I think we can if we remove that obstacle. One thing the opponents did in both of these lawsuits, the one against the non-public schools last year, education opportunity accounts, the one against charter schools this year, they used the same argument. And they said that our Constitution, they're using wording from 1891 about common schools, does not allow, how can they say that does not allow funding for a public school just because it's different, run differently, but it's the public school providing all these opportunities? How can you bring a lawsuit against that and say you're looking out for the best interests of our children? The good news is that was a very, very small bill. Like you said, it would limit authorizers to local school districts. Many of them have made it clear they're not going to support that. So let's remove that obstacle. Let's create some other authorizers. Let's create a charter school commission that can hear appeals from people who are turned down or can create and authorize charter schools. Let's do that.
Well, do you expect to hear opposition from teachers' unions and the whole hierarchy of education?
Does the sun rise in the east? I mean, But think about this. We learned a long time ago in America that monopolies don't work in most areas of our society. What other area of our society do we force everyone to do the same thing? How long do you think it would last if we forced everyone to buy their groceries at the same grocery store or buy their kids' clothes for school at the same store? What if there weren't options on that? Do you think that would be a problem? Do you think we would probably have some protest over that and we'd be seeing some competition come in? But why in education do we not also see the benefit of giving options and alternatives to parents? We found out monopolies don't work. One size fits all doesn't work. So I think this has to be about what's best for students. And yeah, we're going to get lots of opposition, out-of-state opposition. There will be funding come from these DC groups and a lot of anti-school choice groups from the teachers' unions. They're also unhappy with us because during this session, legislation was passed that we supported that requires teachers' unions to collect their dues from individual teachers and not use the paycheck automatic paycheck deduction that school districts were using to send money to the unions. We said taxpayers shouldn't be involved in sending money to the unions. So now they have to collect all those dollars, and they're suing that bill to stop that too. But I don't know what their basis is. I mean, why shouldn't they have to collect that just like everybody else has to? So.
Well, Jim, I want to switch gears real quickly while we're down to about the last 8 minutes. Right to work was a huge fight, and how long ago was it?
6 years, 2017.
Yeah, I was thinking 2017. Yeah. And I think that, municipalities, counties have benefited from that because it's actually, I think, made bidding more competitive on projects, but it's lowered costs of projects. Yeah. And you made a good point before the show about we see Governor Beshear talking about Kentucky's booming economy and adding jobs, and that's true, and it's great news.
It is,
but a lot of groundwork was laid probably by previous governors, but there's a lot of things in that formula that create those jobs. Yeah. And I would have to say that right to work figures in there somewhere.
Yeah.
To make Kentucky more competitive.
Yeah. Well, we know from site selectors that make these decisions about where these large companies are going to go. Mm-hmm. We know we go all the way back more than a decade working on this at the Institute. And you remember, Jim, in 2014, Warren County, in December of 2014, passed a countywide right-to-work law, the first in the nation, because in 1978, the legislature had delegated to the counties certain legislative authority, one of which was economic development. And of course, who's going to be able to argue that that's not an economic development issue? Right. So we had several counties, 13 counties, that passed their own right-to-work ordinances. And then we had 80 more that wanted to, but then the unions went to court, like they do. They hide behind the judge and hide behind the courtroom to try to stop any good policy, the free market policy. So but what that did, Jim, is that caused local communities to step up, and local fiscal courts, because a lot of these areas that passed the local right to work, they were represented in Frankfort by legislators who had voted against right to work. So all of a sudden, those legislators were forced to decide: am I going to go with my local folks, or am I going to go with what at that time Greg Stembo, the speaker, said, or the party said? Right. And so many of them, and that's when the Republicans began to really take over the legislature, was following that, because in the 2016 election, Republicans grabbed the control of the House for the first time in at least a century, maybe ever. Who knows? I mean, nobody seems to know for sure, but they did. They certainly did for the first time in a century. Okay, so what does that say? That says I think that the voters understand these issues better than we sometimes give them, or better than the superintendents, better than the legislators give them credit for. They know when the education system's not doing well, and they know when other states are outdoing us, like they were with right to work. So the site selector said, you need right to work, if nothing else, to send the message that you're economically competitive. Right. And what happened? Look at what's happened. And the governor's right. We've had record growth, record increase on a policy that, had he been in office, he would have vetoed. Of course, this legislature would have overridden the veto. Right. But here he's out there taking credit for this, and the legislative leaders, they're frustrated by that because they want credit. But you know what? As far as from a policy perspective, we don't really care who gets the credit as much. I mean, it's important, but what's more important is more Kentuckians have good jobs. We've got more economic growth than we've had in the history, perhaps, of our Commonwealth. I think the governor even said that. Yeah. So he needs to recognize that these policies do make a difference, and the policies that his own party and his own inner circle have really vehemently opposed. Now, another policy on that got passed was the prevailing wage repeal on public projects. Yeah. But now we're beginning to see the impact not only of right to work with all these jobs, but also with the impact of prevailing wage. And there's a brand new impact of repeal of prevailing wage. And there's a new report out by the Mackinac Center for Public Policy up in Michigan, a great organization. And this new report has also included Kentucky on the impact of repealing prevailing wage. And it's showing how we're benefiting. We're saving taxpayer dollars on on public road, on building highways and on transportation costs.
Sure.
For example, they have found that Kentucky has cut the cost of building, paving, and maintaining new roads by up to $7,000 per mile here. And all the paving that's going on, all the road work that's going on, even here locally.
Right.
But it's going on across the Commonwealth because the battery factory, for example, the battery factory's coming into Glendale, into Bowling Green. They have to have roads. They have to have transportation. And so all these things fit together, And when you talk about the impact of policy, I think sometimes we need to look back and see what the impact of that was. And this has been the first real research, I think, that has really been done that can show the real impact of repeal of prevailing wage on public projects. And you know what that means? When we save those dollars on roads or on schools or on justice centers or whatever it is, that means we can repair schools that need to be repaired. We can have more resources to build schools. The problem with our opponents a lot of times, with all due respect, is they don't think there's any end to the amount of taxpayer dollars.
Right.
But resources are scarce. There's a limit to how much taxpayers can afford and to how much our state can afford. So when we save those dollars and we use them more wisely and better, that benefits everybody. And we're seeing the growth in our state because of it, I think. So.
Well, I think spending tax dollars, it's easy to spend other people's money till you run out of it.
Well, that's what was it Margaret Thatcher said.
Yeah, Margaret Thatcher.
Socialism is great till and that's really a great point. It's like on this report about saving on prevailing wage. Report author Michael Hicks here, who's the director of Ball State University's Center for Business Economic Research, but he said this, and I quote, that the Bluegrass State has, quote, saved considerable money in highway construction and maintenance by eliminating prevailing wage mandates. And and Michael Lefebvre at the Mackinac Center confirmed that. He said, this reflects responsible management of scarce resources. And so why would, there again, that's another reason to have more competition in areas like you talked about bidding. Same thing with education. When you have more competition, something happens. Florida is spending less per pupil in their public schools than we are, but they're getting better results. And that's what happens when you have more competition, more transparency about what's really happening. You don't hide your head in the sand. You face it and you say, let's have all options here. It saves money. It improves the product, whatever that is, even education.
Well, Jim, we're just down to the wire here. Give us, our listeners, a snapshot of we've been talking about BIPS.org and the Bluegrass Institute. Tell us a little bit, quickly, your elevator speech about the Bluegrass Institute's mission.
Well, our mission is to move Kentucky away from government dependency toward economic prosperity for individuals and families, and to make sure that we're engaging and educating and inspiring our fellow Kentuckians. And Jim, where we're at in the country, we can be the fastest growing, most innovative state in America, right here. We are in the prime spot to do it. But we have to get these policies right. And too many of our economic policies have looked like blue states. Now, our politics has gotten redder. But when you look at government spending, per capita incomes, and government regulation, we need to make improvements. And that's what we're committed to, educating Kentuckians and changing our trajectory.
All right.
Thank you.
And Jim, if people want to contact you for information, the website is www.bipps.org.
Yeah.
BIPS.org.
BIPS.org. And you can find my email on there, jwaters@freedomkentucky.com. Spell out Kentucky, long name, amazing results.
I'll have to remember that one, Jim. Well, Jim, it's been great to have you back in the studio.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back here in Bardstown. Such a beautiful area, a really great community, and it's growing, and people are benefiting. We want to see this all across Kentucky. That's what we're about.
Right. Right. Well, I will tell you, as a lifetime resident, it's been amazing to see the changes just in the last 20 years, the growth, because I remember when the population sign used to say 4,300, people.
Yeah.
And
what is it now?
Oh, it's over 10,000, has to be.
One other thing is, 40 years ago, all of Kentucky was as wealthy as all of these other states that we compare ourselves with. But we fell behind because we made the wrong choices. It's time to make the right choices.
All right, that'll do it. We'll see you next Wednesday for Bradford Brooks.
Hometown Radio, WBRT Bardstown, 1320 AM, 97.1 FM, and on 94.9 FM in Lebanon, playing all the classics from country's legends.